Hey, everybody, I'm Sean Robinson.
I'm Carson Grubaugh. This is Living the Line. And today, very excited, we're being joined by Andy Barron, whose book, Sean, can you waggle that around? I did a review on a few weeks ago. A sub, I'm so apologetic that I don't remember which one of our subscribers turned me on to your work, Andy. But as soon as I looked it up online and saw it, I scrambled to order myself a copy. And when I got it in, I was just absolutely thrilled with the work. And then even more thrilled to be able to talk to you about it. So thanks for joining us.
No, that's great. Thanks for having us. And yeah, looking forward to talking through about my work.
Yeah.
Where are you right now, Andy? A bunker in where?
I'm in South London in the UK. Just for any of your listeners and viewers, I am originally from the northeast of England. So you'll have to excuse my accent at points during the interview.
Perfectly understandable. Don't worry about it. And your bunker has some Jim Woodring.
We've got a couple of original Jim Woodrings behind us. Yeah, absolutely.
They're small. I would have expected them to be twice that size.
Yeah, they are a bit smaller than you think. I've got one page from Congress of the Animals, and this was a cover illustration. Really beautiful drawings, yeah, as you'd expect.
I rarely see a debut book, at least a debut collection of some type that is so like visually like accomplished and put together in a way that's like cohesive. And I don't. It seems like most people it takes an awful lot of time to get to the level of even just like rendering, let alone storytelling and everything else. So you haven't been just doing these in a vacuum, right? You're not.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sean. And I should probably explain that I've been drawing on comics for about 8 years, and I've been self-publishing for a long time. So the book that we're talking about today is just being published this year. It's by a French publisher called The Mansion Press, but it's actually collecting 8 or 9 years worth of comics, which has been like a really interesting experience for me to look back over that body of work and see it collected. But totally understand that for like 99% of people reading this book, this will be the first time they've come across it. Yeah, so it's kind of looking at these works together. I think there is a kind of thread, but the work produced over a long period of time.
But I would like agree with Sean that even if I took any one of these stories in isolation, assuming it was the first one you put out, back in the day, it still, I would say, comes out the gate fully formed. And that's not to say that you haven't evolved since then, but it's the impression of an artist that really has their voice solidified. So what was going on maybe before that got you to that such a consistent voice?
That is a good question, Carson. So before not really a whole lot in terms of drawn comics. I've always read comics. I've read comics since I was a kid. I always wanted to draw comics. And I've always drawn, I've always done art, but I've never told stories with comics before starting this series. But the character of was kind of the first thing. I'd had this little character which had been floating around in sketchbooks and kind of, in the margins of notebooks for a long time. And it was in around kind of 2012 when I actually decided I wanted to start telling stories and making comics. I think it can be quite a difficult thing to get started with any kind of project, but particularly this idea of building a whole world and this character that I had kind of in mind. It was just that first step of like drawing that first short comic with this character. And I think the first story I drew was like 3 pages long. It was not very polished. It wasn't very accomplished. It's not collected in this version, in this edition. But it really kind of set me going, and that idea that you can build something much bigger with very small steps. You can start adding up little 5-page comics, and that can build into a bigger world, a bigger picture. I think that's the key thing to stress, is like this character has existed for much longer than the comics have, in my mind. And it's just, these comics have proven the best place to tell his stories, I think.
He's a visually striking. The character as I'm holding up just the page here. and you can see one of the later drawings. And one of the characteristics that really is visually interesting to me is this either jawline or smile that he has no matter what. And I'm kind of inclined to think of it as a jawline because some of the scenes of quite striking misery, he's still got this sort of you know, and your style, you know, you obviously are able to rotate these characters around in your mind. You get an idea that you could make a you know, a plasticine model of it or something like that, and yet from certain angles there's sort of a classic cartoony rubberiness to them, a la like Merry Melodies style, you know, cartoon short or something like that. So it's almost like you've kind of breathed life into a sort of flat cartoon representational thing and sort of allowed those forms to sort of rotate and you know, have a little bit more dimensionality to them.
I think so. That's a interesting point, Sean, and I think Om's face is so featureless. It's just two eyes and a kind of white, as you say, is it a jawline, is it a nose, is it a mouth?
Right.
And I think that's kind of been a challenge for me to try and express a character with so few features, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And something I think I've got better at as I've written more stories. It's kind of like this blank character that maybe people can project their own meaning onto, but there is a character inside that, you know, it's not just like a blank dummy walking through these scenes. I want people to be able to like feel the emotion that character's going through.
Right.
Was it those initial sketches of the character that really incentivized you to turn to narrative storytelling? Was there something in that pushed you that way?
I think it's just because it'd been working. I say like this was really thought out. It wasn't. This was like a doodle that I'd just been doing for a number of years. And as I say, I'd been reading comics and kind of maybe being. I didn't actually think I had the skill to draw comics, if I'm honest. It just seemed like here's a character ready made. I can try and do something with this.
What kind of prior training did you have?
Training. So I studied illustration at our college.
Okay.
I should say I'm a pretty dreadful commercial illustrator. If someone gave me a brief and said, make this, you know, newspaper article, draw a picture for this, I'd be totally lost. I would have no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
But so I'd studied illustration at Camberwell Art College, which is in South London. That's why I first moved to London. But most of my comic stuff is totally self-initiated. I didn't draw comics at university. I didn't start drawing them until after I'd left. It's just through kind of reading comics and wanting to do something like that. I think the great thing about comics is it can often just be one person. There's nothing, you don't need a huge group of people to get started. You could draw on a scrap of paper, you know, with the cheapest pen or pencil available, and you can still put something out. So yeah, it just seemed like that seemed like the logical step for me.
That makes sense, because if that's just that's one of the things where it's like, if you just came out the gate like that with no formal training, then you're going, oh my God, this guy's just like, these skills are amazing. I think that's the consistency that Sean and I were seeing in it, is someone who had some kind of experience and then brought it to comics.
Yeah, thanks.
It's really impressive.
Carson and I have had a couple conversations recently about sort of evolving style, and that was a struggle, you know, with my early cartooning work, was realizing that you could develop from page to page, but that as a barrier for the reader, you know, you're creating a differential between these two different things that should be ideally one experience. And it seems like, I don't know, I mean, it's very intimidating for me to look at this collection and see, you know, how you've managed to. It seems, I mean, obviously there's an evolution that's happening inside the book, but you've managed to sort of keep it at bay from a sort of interfering with the readership standpoint by having the chunks of story be sort of discrete units. It's a very clever structural conceit. to the book. So when you published them originally, these are actual discrete units. Do you have a few of those with you that you could show us?
Yeah, I've got some. So when I first started publishing these were just mini comic zines. As I say, 8 pages, 10 pages maximum. So these are some of my early little A5s, printed in, like, you can see how thin that is. Can you imagine buying a comic that thin? It's like, you know, I'm trying to sell this. These were really small editions. I'm talking probably printed like 50 to 100 of these. And I've still got some under my bed to this day, you know, like didn't
Collectors
manage to
take
shift all of
note.
it.
Yeah. Uncirculated copies of Andy Barron.
This is the kind of early style I was working in. This one's collected in the anthology.
Yeah.
It's kind of funny because before I'd received my copies of the anthology, I hadn't actually looked back at those stories in like a long, long time. And I was probably a bit apprehensive about looking at them. You don't want to look over your old work. It's like you spot all the mistakes and what doesn't work so well. But I think, if I can say this, I do feel like they do really hang together this was produced over 8 years. I think it's partly the art style, but I also think it's the kind of tone of voice of the stories, of the writing. That's kind of what carries through that set. It's why I do think it does work as a body of work, or a set of stories, even though they're produced over a very long time and quite different skill levels, I would say. So yeah, this was kind of like a really fun experience for me to actually have a chance to look over some of that again.
And it seems like you've allowed yourself to treat them as discrete units, especially when you started, but you have left room for the mythology to develop as you've gone on, because at first they do seem a little more just like one-offs. But as it goes, like, did the story exist always in your head, or the nuggets that come up as you're writing then expand and you can pick up on that?
Yeah, I think this is like I think it's what comics are perfect for, because most comic series evolve over like a long period of time. They're made up of smaller units, and then they're building like a grand mythology, don't they? You know, if they keep going for long enough. And that was something that really appealed to me, partly because at the beginning it was quite intimidating to think of drawing anything longer than 10 pages. So you could just be like, I'm doing a 5-page story. I just need to finish that one 5-page story. And then as I've got slightly more confident, it is just building up those layers. So you do your 5-page story, then it's a 12-page story, then it's your 20-page story. So in the new book, I've done a story which is about 60 pages. It's the longest I've done. And that was, you know, a challenge for me. It was like a new experience, but I think it's added like an extra layer of depth to the collection. But I would also like people to be able to read these in isolation if they chose to. Like, you don't need to have read all of these stories or in order. I really feel like you could dive into this world at any point and still get some kind of, you know, pleasure out of it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It seems like some of the development is happening. You know, I don't want to call them gag strips, but some of the first few are definitely more. They seem along the lines of, well, what if he meets a dinosaur that seems friendly, and then it takes its mask off, and it's not friendly underneath the mask. In that the sort of incidental stories, you know, where it seems like your concept is a little bit more on the surface, whereas some of the other ones, you know, even when we're about, you know, a third of the way through this story here, for instance, you know, we have these really strong resonant images of, you know, the lawgiver and punishment and the randomness of justice, and, you know, concepts of like, you know, enslavement, and, you know, it's a very like rich kind of tapestry.
I think I've got more interested in like exploring. I love writing. I love writing these stories. In some ways, that's like the most pleasurable part. Executing the stories and actually drawing them is like, can be difficult. But I love that thing where you get that idea for a story and you just know what you want to express, and then you have the months afterwards where you're actually trying to get that down on paper. But I'm really interested in looking at those kind of like archetypal things that probably this can look like a very alien world. Comics can look totally out there, but I think when I'm writing them, it's very human experiences I'm trying to get across. And maybe those experiences that everyone goes through in some way. That probably sounds like a strange thing to say if people read these comics, but that's where I'm trying to get at with my writing, but presenting that in quite this, you know, it's a unique world. It has a slight look to it and style. Yeah.
I think the archetypal thing comes through super strong. I mean, that's one of my big takeaways from the book. And the one that Sean pointed out, I think, is the story for me where it feels like it turned into something that's a little more ongoing. Yeah, like that chopping block is like the crux for me in the book, at least. But you keep coming back to the word "when I'm writing," which in such a visual story like this is surprising to me. So what is that? Like, is it scripted or is it just all visual writing?
It's, yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely about certain images. Might suggest, it might not be a story, it might just be an image to start with. So the story that you just held up there, Sean, which is called The Law, that started with just that character, just in a sketchbook and with this big axe. And I was like, well, there's something in that. It can be a kind of image that kind of sits in a sketchbook for quite a while. And then I might be kind of letting that stew for a little bit. And then it kind of, you know, it evolves into a story. I often think the writing process, this sounds strange to say, it's not often with words, it's just through drawings. It can be just through sketching and doodling. I find that is the best way to kind of, let's say what I'm actually thinking about at the moment, you know, it's just getting something out on paper and then certain characters come out or an event. I think there's a story in the book where, if I can try and put it this way, this might be a good illustration. It's called Tantra. And in the story, one of the characters is like sculpting another character out of clay, which definitely I think has these kind of like, you know, it has these kind of biblical like things I'm riffing on there. And that just sat in my sketchbook for like years. I had that in my sketchbook for like 3 years. I was like, what if a character made someone out of clay? And then it was like, this is the one. Thanks, Sean. I was actually I was traveling. I was in Malaysia like a couple of years after this. And there was a statue of a Hindu god tearing his chest open. It's an image I've used like again and again after that. And that kind of just, it became the ending to that story, if that makes sense. So this kind of thing that's been floating around in my head in my sketchbooks for a number of years, it just kind of linked up. That's probably a terrible way to write things, but it's just the way it works for me. I tend to have lots of different ideas in the sketchbook at any one time. But that makes it quite exciting.
That's a really compelling one. And it was one of the stories that was making me wonder, you know, when we reach for these kinds of archetypal ideals, it seems oftentimes like the whole idea of an archetype that you have some other reservoir of experience as a human being to draw from that is similar to the myths of the past or whatever. You know, the earliest creation myth that we have is someone killing their grandmother Tiamat and splitting her skull open, and half of her skull becoming the earth that we live on. You know, these sort of ideas of the world as body and the body as world, and you know, the creation from the interior. And you don't have to be a myth. You don't have to be someone who's a mythological scholar in order to reach those same kinds of conclusions. You just have to be somebody who's attuned to the world that you inhabit.
I totally agree with you there, Sean. I think it's like, it's not a textbook, and I'm not an expert on these things, or like, you know, I'm not a biblical scholar or know loads about kind of Eastern religions, but there are certain things you react to and you spark off, and kind of, you can kind of appreciate just from a kind of human experience, if that makes sense. I think that's exactly the way I would kind of approach it. A lot of people ask why the book is called Om, and like, you know, I know it has kind of a Hindu and Buddhist kind of thing. I'm not an expert in those fields. It's just something that I kind of connected to, and, you know, it meant something to me when I was kind of reading about that.
And that, I mean, it's in like the kind of pose of the figure on the front and all of that. So I would be, my assumption was that that's something you spend a fair amount of time reading about and thinking about? It's just something you pick up more passing, or is it something you study pretty deeply?
Well, it was. I used to read about it when I was a bit younger, probably when I was starting these comics. I think one of the things that really connected to me was that there seemed to be this theme of like what can be expressed without words, and kind of a culture or something kind of spiritual about silence. You know, like, can silence be kind of a sign of strength or kind of something worth celebrating rather than, you know? And that just seemed to kind of gel perfectly with doing this wordless story. I think these stories, when I'm writing them, should try and communicate something without words. And I would love to think that the readers are taking something away from the stories. It's not just like, you know, funny naked man walks across the stage and something happens. I'd like people to be able to like react to these stories and take something away from each one.
It's interesting that both Carson and our reader suggested the Jim Woodring connection, and you can see some of those sort of surface things. Obviously, he's somebody working in silent comics as well, but then you have sort of his uses of things like dervishes and minarets and other sort of design motifs that are sort of liberally borrowed from other places and sort of all mishmashed together, as well as a sort of like appreciation for classic stylization of classic cartooning and things like that, which I think is very much in your work as well, but of course radically different from a surface perspective in terms of the rendering and such. So where did you first encounter Jim's comics, and would you consider him an influence?
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret. I'm sitting in front of two Jim Woodring drawings. He's my hero. I first started reading his books when I was about 15. So as I said, I'm from the northeast of England. We had two small comic shops up there when I was growing up, and it was the big, I don't know if you remember this one, it was the big Fantagraphics collection, the Frank book.
Is it the complete Frank? Is that?
Yeah, the complete, it was a beautiful hardback edition.
Okay.
So I picked that one up, and it was at that kind of age where I was coming out with superhero comics and going into more of the kind of Fantagraphics indie side of things, exploring those different ways of telling stories, and it's something that's really stuck with me, and it's definitely had a big impact on the way I work. I think it is specifically that thing of, maybe you're not the best writer, you can't write stories, you can't write short stories or prose, but there are still valid ways to tell a story, and there are kind of things that are unique to comics that can be done in this way. I mean, a massive influence to me.
Is written language too concrete for you in a way, and images give you flexibility?
Yeah, I mean, I should probably say I'm just a very bad writer. So like with I overwrite. So I mean, I love writing. I love reading. I love reading books, but it's just kind of my ability. I'm a visual person. I like communicating through pictures, so it just makes a lot more sense for me. This is kind of the world I know. It's comics. It's kind of telling stories, panel by panel. But it's not kind of it's not the only way I'd be looking at for inspiration. I think, what am I trying to say here? It's comics are one way of telling stories, but there are also like books and films and stuff. I think you've got to be drawn on all of this stuff and trying to kind of feed that into your work, into your writing.
But your stuff strikes me as like leading by example rather than telling, which seems a more visual mode of describing things for some reason.
Could you go into that a bit further, Carson? Tell me a bit more what you're thinking there.
Yeah, particularly there's a quote in my mind from Plato where it's a letter that Plato wrote where he says any serious man is not going to write his real opinion or something along those lines, which is crazy for someone who wrote like the gigantic dialogues that he wrote. And a lot of Plato scholars kind of use that to suggest that maybe Plato wasn't actually serious about any of the views put forth in his work, but that they're just rhetorical devices for learning, and that he wouldn't tell you what he actually knows. But like if you're going through the process of a conversation with him, then you're being led through how to think instead of told an opinion. And I feel like your work is doing, by switching into the visual realm and moving away from words, it's like, I don't know, there's some connection there, I think.
I think so. Maybe this is along the right lines, but you're leaving a bit of space for the reader to kind of put their own imprint onto these stories and these characters. I think is a conscious decision I've made. I also think this idea of how much of the story do you actually tell? I think this is a really important thing for any writing. Like you're in control of where this story starts and where it ends. And there isn't a kind of, okay, there are structures you can follow for that, but you don't always have to follow those. You could start a story kind of anywhere. It could end at any point that you choose it to. And I think that's kind of, if you Sean, the story that you held up earlier, The Law, I'm going to go back to this one.
Yeah.
But at the opening of that story, Orm is just being chased by these figures. You have no idea why he's being chased or what their kind of goal is. It just opens with him running away. And I think that kind of allows the reader to kind of put a bit of their own spin onto that. I'm not saying they have to write their own beginning, but it leaves space for them to kind of, what is actually going on here? Like, what position has that character found themselves in? If that's kind of along the lines of what you're asking, Carson.
A little bit, or also just like, I don't know, taking someone out and just like building a fence, but not sitting down and describing it, you know?
Yeah.
Your work seems to do that for me in a spiritual sense because of it. It leaves me open to the interpretation. So it makes me an active participant.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I think it's something I kind of would be aiming towards, definitely.
Andy, would you describe purple to me?
Sorry, this sounds like a philosophical thing. I don't know if I could describe purple, but I could point it out to you in one of my books, probably.
Really curious how you ended up with all of your line work purple, and it's an interesting visual, you know, and you exploit it like to the hilt. Some very interesting places. So for instance, once you've established this, we've got this essentially like all of your line work in the book is reproduced purple.
Yeah.
And then sometimes when you really go for it in a story and you've got this black, you've got you've still got the purple binding line, which is actually lighter than the colors being filled. It's a very interesting visual motif. And then of course, like this visually stunning story here where you break it down just to 2-color. And this is one of the ones that we were talking about before we actually started recording that has a very lithographic look to it with a very soft applied texture of some sort in there. So, I mean, basically, like, how did you arrive at that particular decision? Was that something that, how did it happen?
Probably not that considered. I think in my early comics, I can say this, I think early on, I wasn't very happy with my line work. I thought it was quite basic, and I really feel like I used color. It sounds a bit bad. I'm not talking myself down. I think I used color as a bit of a crutch in some ways. It was like, let's make this super bold. You know, it's a fine liner drawn, and I need some way to lift it. And that was all done digitally. So those early stories, again, if I can pull one out here, but this again, this is all kind of colored digitally. I think the blue was probably the purple was a happy accident in some ways, but again, I think it's important to have it's a consistent through line through all of the stories. Apart from the black book, which we might come on to a bit later, but that had a kind of conscious decision. It becomes these things of like an identifying mark almost. So is it the colors of Orm, so the white skin and the yellow nipples? I'll have to mention them. And the blue line work. It becomes like a characteristic of each story, and hopefully it is something that ties these together through the collection.
So I mean, as far as the first time you actually used it, you felt almost like it's a compensation device, like it just gave it something visually distinctive when your line work wasn't as distinctive?
Yeah, I think so. I've definitely gone through this process, this kind of journey of like not really liking my line work. I used to look at my kind of pages and be like, it's like I need to put this in Photoshop and really do loads of stuff to it. And I think it was the story Tantra, which is the first time I started inking with a brush. Made a much more conscious decision to like, I wanted the pages to be final. I want this to be like a nice piece of artwork. Yeah, so this was one of the first books I printed in risograph as well. But I really made an effort here to try and like improve my line work. And that's partly looking to people like Jim Woodring, but all the other artists I liked growing up. That's kind of what drew me to comics. It's like this beautiful line work and kind of, brush and ink and all that kind of good stuff that like I wanted to be a bit like that.
Yeah, and by the time we hit the mature style or the current Andy style, towards the end, you've sort of codified your brushstroke into a very. It's almost everything is made up of a taper to thick to taper, and you've sort of trained yourself into that particular mark, which is the same characteristic mark that we see on the jawline / smile /
Yeah, I think that's it.
Nose.
Like, I think people have called my drawings like squishy. Like all the characters have this kind of squishy kind of feel to them, and that is something I think I tried to do that when I used to draw with a fine liner in my original drawings, and the brush is just so much better for capturing that in a figure. And when I think part of this is like through without words, any comic, even if it's got words, but how much of your story is actually told through the pose of your character or through the action or how a character stands. And for whatever reason, mine has developed into that. I think it is that kind of fluid or squishy style of character. Squishy is probably not the technical term, but
yeah, I just have to ask you. This is just so reminiscent of 1930s animation. I mean, this could be a depiction of hell in a Merry Melodies cartoon circa 1932. So, I mean, have you studied these? Is it just randomness? Look at this particular pose right here with the hose arm shovel, which is perfectly communicative and gets the pose immediately. But it's got this, I mean, where does that come from?
So I can't remember. I'm going to sound terrible here. I can't remember the name of the artist or the book, but you will definitely know this book. It's this book that lots of animators used to use. What is he called? It's got this famous page with all of the cartoon hands at different angles. This probably is not doing a good description, is it?
That one.
That one book. He's the animator.
We edit in.
Yes, he's the animator who, I think he worked on Bambi. So he animated the owl character in Bambi. Basically, lots of cartoonists seem to reference this book, so I picked up a copy. It's only about, the version I've got is about 30 pages long, but I often find drawn textbooks like really tedious. I would buy them and then like never look at them or read 2 pages. Whereas this is just visual and it has so many great references of like through lines of characters, or your action line of carrying across things. I learned more from that 30 pages of books than I did probably from 3 years of art college. I've actually drawn figures. I will have to take this book out. There? It's in the next room, so I might have to. By Preston Blair.
Preston Blair.
You know this book?
No, I've never seen it.
It's quite big. My copy's like falling to pieces. All the pages are falling out.
Okay, so we're going to buy this, but Carson and I are both going to buy this before we publish this video, just so everybody's watching.
Before we publish this tomorrow morning,
It has, these really great things. There's no, sometimes you pick up these drawn textbooks and the writing is like really dry, or it feels like it was written about 80 years ago. Whereas this is just like really big cartoons on each page, such great, like, every cartoonist needs to know this stuff. I think it's like, there's action lines going through. Some of these this is very old school cartooning, but like cartoon takes. So like, I'll have to find this page if I can. This is the one that you might have seen floating around on the internet somewhere. Hand construction.
Okay.
See?
Okay. So yeah, I could see the line work influence too. Derived from that. Yeah.
But I've heard like people like Terry Gilliam and stuff have all like referenced this book, and it just was something I'd kind of heard about and picked up. And I think it cost about £5. It was absolutely nothing. It's been, you know, a Bible for me for drawing.
That's
A
great.
book like
It's
that. Sorry, go ahead, Sean.
Oh, it's just interesting how insular comics can be, because occasionally, you know, I would talk to somebody about something, and you know, they'd look at a still from something, and I'm thinking, oh, look, classic animation, and somebody would be like, that guy's totally ripping off Al Columbia. It's like, oh, you mean you haven't seen this before? Like, you think Al Columbia is really cool because you don't know the same things that he does. And once again, not saying I don't think Al Columbia is, you know, a great artist and everything. What I'm saying is that if you don't own Al Columbia's record collection, you know, like this is a phenomenon of like the local band type thing as well. You know, it's just great to see. You know, you've actually gone to the source. You know, you're not knocking off, you know, fellow cartoonists who are mining the same material. You know, you're
I think that's a good point. I think it comes back to what we were talking about earlier. I think if you're only looking at comics, like that's great. Mm-hmm. There are millions of amazing comics, but it's one medium. So I think you need to be looking broader. I think that comes with writing as well. Like, you're not going to learn everything about writing or telling stories just through reading comics. You'll learn maybe one or a couple of ways of telling stories. So yeah, that book, I definitely recommend everyone buys that. I think it's a fantastic resource.
I want to come back to that with music too, because it struck me that music's a big part of it. But before we go to that, I want to go back to the line work aspect too, because I know you have some originals there. So those early pages were still drawn physically and scanned. That's always been your process?
Yeah. So maybe this would be helpful, Carson, because I think I've got a couple of the early pages here.
Yeah. Because there is a sense with the colored line that you might be working entirely digitally. And when you told me you worked physically, I was very excited about that combination that you're using.
So I'm going to show you some panels from an early story here. Can you see this okay?
Yeah, mm-hmm. Fantastic.
So this is all fine liner, and like, I think there's lots of things going on here. I was quite hesitant about doing backgrounds or scenery, but you know, what I was interested in was getting people to very clearly read the actions of the characters. But I was never happy with this. As like, I wouldn't look at that and go, oh, this like looks really good as a finished piece of work. So when I've come on to kind of working with a brush, so I'm going to show you a couple of pages here, if that's okay. This is some of my brush work. So this was the inside dust jacket for the collected edition. So you'll have seen that there. But also,
here's the
that's right. Yeah. So the inside has this illustrated image.
Which, by the way, I'm notorious for throwing away dust jackets, and I had to keep this one. Like, that's how nice this dust jacket is.
Thanks. I've had a few comments. I think people really enjoyed that drawing, and I really enjoyed working on that drawing. I think I really loved working on that interior illustration. I think it was important to me that it didn't just have a white kind of, you know, plain thing, because then it is just redundant. It's a piece of paper. But it was just a chance to kind of showcase a big illustration like that. So yeah, really, really fun to work on.
You mentioned beforehand that some of your work is going to a gallery show. Will you be showing those earlier works, or because you're not happy with them as like a finished piece in and of itself, stripped of color, are you too hesitant to show that in person?
Yeah, well, so that's right. So someone has been in touch from Brussels, a comic art gallery. So they're actually interested in seeing a bit of both. So we're going to be looking through some of the brushwork and some of the fine liner stuff. But I'm quite excited. I've never done anything like that before. My pages have just been in a very big pile under my bed again. So it's kind of interesting that people want to look at these as a piece of art or a finished piece of artwork. It's often been that thing where like my line work has been, let's get it just done enough so I can get it on the computer and start, you know, doing Photoshop magic. But I'd rather get back to this point where it's like, let's make this a really nice finished drawing, and kind of, I think that will show through in the finished comics as well.
Well, those originals look fantastic. I mean, it really seems like you've.
Thank you.
Really
Thanks very much. Yeah.
So you know, at the interest of, I am really interested in knowing about your process for specifically the 2-color pages, the 2-color stories that have the texture. I was describing this as lithographic before. You're not going to see the details, here on this, but each of these pages does not have flat color, but instead has this finely varied surface that looks an awful lot like a lithographic process, where an older sort of art procedure. If I was like just looking at it, like not examining it, like holding it right up to my face, I would think it was a 2-color lithography process. But obviously, it's still 4-color reproduction. So how did you do that?
Yeah, that's a good question, Sean. So it's probably worth pointing out most of the early stories were this kind of digital color.
Right.
I'd done a lot of these mini comics. So I did about 4 or 5 of these. I then collected those into a little self-published edition. But then I really wanted to try doing some risograph. And I did 2 stories in risograph. I did a story called Tantra, which I don't have any copies of left. And then I also did the story A Man, which I think you pointed out there. So this is the cover. That's the cover for A Man.
Oh, wow.
So risograph, if you haven't used it before, and I'm no expert on the technical process, but it's a bit like a photocopier, but it kind of builds up an image like a screen print. So you can build up different layers of color with different amounts of ink. That's the key thing with a risograph. You can do kind of tints and shades, and you can overlay colors. So you could kind of use 2 or 3 colors and actually build quite a rich image, build up in layers like a screen. So this is actually just 2 different layers which were separated out on the computer, just like you do with this screen print. So 1 layer for the dark blue line work, and then this red color. But as I say, because you can do tints going right down to like a very low coverage of ink down to this kind of color here. Probably can't see that too well.
Right.
But these very heavy colors, and it's got that kind of texture that you're describing is just kind of part of the charm of risograph. It's like part of why I think people are attracted to it. It looks great on like uncoated paper. So that's just something I've been wanting to try. I think going back to that earlier point as well, when I was talking about using color as a crutch, this was a way to kind of really strip things back and go, my line work's got to be stronger here. It's only got 1 color to fall back on. I can't like throw, it's not Photoshop. I can't throw like every single color under the sun on that page. It's something I've really liked working with. In the collected edition, so I've had to try and do like a digital version of that. So the texture is a texture that I bought online, but it's treated in the same way. It's kind of, I've just done tones or tints and then overlaid the texture over the image. But I'm actually quite happy with how it's come out. I think it's quite a good approximation of the risograph look.
It's very convincing. It's very intriguing to me. I don't know if you want to plug the texture seller, or if you could just, let me know after the fact.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
The cover has that feel too. Did you use that same thing on the gradient on the cover?
Yeah, I did. Probably. Well, how would I put this? There are stories in the book which are like should definitely have that texture applied. I just wanted to try it on the cover to see if it could build some consistency. I'm happy with how the cover came out, definitely, but I think what I'm interested in going back to with the next stories is more of like this bold, very bold color, very bold flat color with maybe a more refined line work. So yeah, the cover does have that on as well. And it's probably worth mentioning the Black Book, which is the long story that finishes this collection. When I was self-publishing, I was going to do that as a risograph book, okay? And it was like, well, it's self-published. I can't make it too long. It's got to be like 12, 20 pages, max. And then when, so Julian, who's the publisher for Mansion Press, approached me, that really gave me a freedom to go, I'm not restricted to do this little 20-page risograph comic. I can do a 60-page or a 70-page story. Which, but I still want to keep that risograph feel. I still had that risograph look and feel in my head. for that story.
And that's that the gradients and stuff really show up in that as well. This is another thing I'm wondering about Risograph, because when I'm seeing them, they feel more like a continuous process. They don't feel like a discrete process, like a halftone where everything's broken down into dots. Or is it something like that?
I think it depends how you set up your artwork in Photoshop. So I know there's a really great risograph artist called Ryan Cecil he's got lots of resources available for like how he works with. He does these beautiful risographs where he knocks them down to like the half tone, and he does lots of layers, so you can build a very rich image. That's way beyond my technical ability. I was just like, let's just do 2 colors laid over the top. But I think there's so much flexibility there, and I just think the end product has such a nice feel to it. Yeah. So yeah.
Well, Carson, I would need to have it in front of me, but I'm pretty sure that it uses more of a noise distribution for the half toning, as opposed to a uniform size cells, which is part of what gives it that sort of textured look.
Yeah, it looks like when you showed us the stochastic screening,
right?
Which to me gives a more analog, continuous look to it, which is where you're saying it looks like almost like stone lithograph, where any variation is coming from the surface that the ink is applied to. I think that's the thing that I'm finding really attractive, because I've been grabbing a number of these risograph projects, and I was also very curious about Ohm, because like on the cover and a lot of the stories inside, it was obvious to me that they were risographs at some point, but I can also see it's printed. So it's a really interesting combo.
When we were talking about this with the other gentleman who did risographs, we were mentioning, basically like once you have sort of saturation for a certain kind of technology that was once unavailable, there can be kind of a retreat to the older technologies that kind of comes along with it. Now that full color printing, quote unquote full color printing, is so ubiquitous, and it's on everybody's desk, and it's in your mailbox every day and everything. I mean, 2 color and 3 color all of a sudden looks like shockingly different, right? Because it's like
definitely. I think there was definitely a phase where at conventions, obviously I'm talking a few years ago because it's been so long since conventions have been a thing, but risograph was definitely kind of more prevalent, and people were experimenting with it. I think it's having those restrictions, you've got boundaries, but you can kind of push those slightly. And as you say, Photoshop is a fantastic tool. I couldn't really live without it, but everything's at the click of a button. It's sometimes better to kind of place some of those restrictions, I think, on your artwork. Can open up kind of new ways of working.
So you've mentioned a couple times this last story in the book.
Next, is it the actual? Oh yeah, okay, sorry.
The black book. This was done exclusively for the collection, then, it sounds like.
Yeah, so I'd started working on it before I was contacted by Julian from Mansion Press, but it was very much like, I actually think I had those first 3 pages, which is the statue exploding, for quite a while, just on my drawing desk, and I didn't really know where to take the story after that. And when Julian approached me saying he'd want to collect the edition, he said it was like on the condition that they had the black book as a kind of, a new story for the collection. So yeah, it was kind of started, but really I kind of started working on it in earnest once I knew it was going to be published.
And by the way, that's another reason I can't get rid of because it's those same drawings that make the cover, I assume.
That's right. Yeah.
So those were drawn by themselves, and then you map the Ohm characters over it digitally.
I drew, so those drawings that are on the cover, it's exactly the same line work. I actually just erased the figures in Photoshop and redrew some of the lines, and the same. So that's the kind of magic of Photoshop, isn't it? And I've done that plenty of times, where you're trying to trace something over and re-ink it, and it takes hours to do. In Photoshop, it takes 20 minutes.
I would have done it the opposite way, drawn the statue and then just put the characters up.
Yeah, I had the image with those figures on already.
Okay.
And then the cover came afterwards. I thought it was a strong image, and it kind of, I think for the cover, it kind of, how would I say this? I think some of the themes of the story to me are about kind of life and death, and it sounds a bit heavy, but I love this idea of different two layers to that story. You take that cover off and it's this beautiful, bold statue, and then you take it off and it's crumbled, it's destroyed. It just seemed like a good image to sum up what I think is one of the themes.
So we've got the and then underneath the dust jacket, totally destroyed.
There's another reason I can't get rid of the dust jacket, because the removal of the dust jacket is its own comic device. In a way that I find really beautiful. I will say, and this is where I want to get to music in your book, is I was such a fan of the colors and all of the stuff going through. When we get to the back of the book and it was all black and white, there was a bit of a disappointment for me at first. I was like, oh man, I'm so in love with all of this color. Like, like, is this an earlier story or what?
And then
I want to talk about it, but I don't want to give it away, but you kind of have to mention
let's not
that
visually show it, but there's a turn.
You bring color back into it, and that's where I felt an influence in music from music that I had. There was like this sense of like you're like building anticipation, and then you give the resolve, or you stripped out that thing I want and emotionally manipulated me that way, and then gave me back the thing I want. And it was so much more beautiful. And I don't know, it's just like the end of that song when it hits that perfect note. So I was very curious about the relationship to music and
and kind of rhythm. I think it's a good point. And I'm going to just bring us back slightly to the thing about writing these stories. Even when I was planning the Black Book as like a 16, 20-page risograph comic, the thing that was in my head was, let's have it black and white, and then let's change the color at the end. That was, and I didn't have a story. It was just like, that's a rhythm, that's a kind of the way the story could go. But I actually think it really benefits from the length of the story. I think being 60 pages and then that very sudden change at the end. Sorry, I'm giving away the ending here. I'll try to talk around it. But having a change, you want the reader to be kind of involved in that world, in this black and white world, and then change things very, very suddenly. I think with regards to music, I don't know if I'd say it's music in particular. It's more about the kind of the various different ways you can tell a story and the rhythm a story can have, and how really playing with the reader's expectations is the best way to make a memorable story, I think. It's not through following a kind of set structure or like, I know this is going to happen A, B, and C, beginning, middle, and end. I think playing with those concepts is like, makes for a more powerful experience for the writer, for the reader. It's something I've thought about, Carson. I know you'd asked about this via email as well. I've got an example. It probably sounds a bit silly, but it's something I used to think about a lot. And I was thinking of two different ways of telling stories. So I used to think of a film, The Dark Knight, the Christopher Nolan Dark Knight film, which is a great fun film, but everything is turned up to 11 at all times. So like two characters can't even sit having a conversation over a table without like bombastic music, and eventually it's quite flat, even though everything is very loud and full on. Its actual variety of the way it tells a story is very like, it's all up here. I'm doing a bit of a graph here, but it's very kind of, to me, quite flat. And after a while, that doesn't surprise you, however kind of big the scene is going to be. So I'm going to compare this with something I think is a bit strange, but it's a short story by John Steinbeck called The Red Pony. Have you read this book?
I've not, no.
It's a good Steinbeck story, but it's very slow. There's a little boy, lives on a farm, and he has a red pony, and he looks after the pony. And it goes on like this. Nothing much happens. He just looks after his pony. And it's kind of like down here, if I'd say on the graph, for a long time. And then at the end, it has this really weird little spike of violence. And it like really jumps out after that time of just living in this little, you know, farmland. And it's more memorable. It's a more memorable experience to me. It doesn't need that kind of like full-on action all the time. And I think that's what I try and play with when I'm writing, when I'm drawing these stories together, is where am I actually putting those points of kind of, you could put that point right at the beginning. It could open with the biggest scene in the world and then nothing happens for the rest of the story. That might be interesting. People are going to remember that, you know? I think if lots... Sorry, Sean, go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
No, sorry, just another example, but it's a strange one. There's a film called Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky, and it's incredibly slow. Like, it's quite difficult to watch. And I remember there's this one bit where the characters are walking along a corridor, and it seems to last for like an hour. They're just walking along this corridor, and you go, this is going to be the best thing, and it's going to be the biggest thing in the world when they get to the end of this corridor. And then they get there, and there's nothing there, and they all just shrug their shoulders and go, okay, right, let's go home.
What's the French New Wave film Weekend that has a 45-minute traffic jam?
Well, yeah,
wow.
that's it's they're remembered for a reason, though, aren't they? It's like it hasn't been seen before. It's done in a different way. Yeah,
and that might be part of what seems so, you know, I guess classic is the word that I'm looking for about Ohm, is that you are allowing yourself to have a wide, non-modern dynamic range. You know, in audio terms, this is just called dynamic range. Like, and if you look at a graph of a dynamic range of different recordings, and you see the history of recording, and originally, you know, things have lots of shifts, and you have lots of dynamics and things like that, and eventually, it's just like a big block. It's all filled. You know, everything is filled. You know, because everybody wants to grab them by the throat, and they don't care about the fact that once you grabbed them by the throat, after about 30 seconds, they're done because you don't want to engage with somebody who's grabbing you by the throat, right? You go to the Dark Knight in the theater, and that, you know,
like, you know, it's like they can be exactly. It's like it can be fun. It's a fun experience, but like it has to be different. You know, it has to be something kind of done in a different way, I think. I am kind of interested to see what happens with the new Batman film. Actually, like, do they do something very similar in terms of, you know, that style of kind of bombastic story, or do they do something slightly slower? I don't know.
Yeah, that one actually looks kind of interesting. The two things that when you're talking,
Bat, what's it called?
Sorry, that was
Bat?
The flying rat.
He's a man bat. I don't understand.
Sean's always confused by these Batmans and Spider-Mans and all of these things.
Do they have hyphens? I just don't know. I don't.
Yeah.
But I was thinking of the film Dancer in the Dark by Lars von Trier with Bjork. If you've ever seen that, same thing. Like I almost turned that movie off for the first hour. It was so boring. And then you hit that moment where you're like, oh shit, and then you're engaged. And there's a song that I would recommend you and anyone else listen to by a band called Terra Tenebrosa, and I think it's called Fire Dance, something like that. And it's like this 16 minutes of a Christopher Nolan film and music, like super metal, like dense, like layers and layers and layers. And then they give you about 1 second of like this beautiful angelic resolve note at the end, and then it's done. And you get that moment of like, and I thought about that while I was looking at your book, except you get a little bit more of the angelic moment, but it had that same feeling to me. And I think it extra benefited from being in the collection because you already had that structure in mind, but preceding it with a number of colored stories really messed with my expectation in an extra way that was I think that's when the book turned from, this is a really great book, I'm really excited about the art, to like, holy shit, like went from really good to like, this is a great piece of work.
You've managed to summarize. I mean, summarize isn't quite the right word. You've given the entire book an arc that it might not have previously had. So is that part of what the relief is at the end that you've provided this, or is this an artistic relief? Are you looking forward to the colorful future where you do work with your mature skills? Like what's
Yeah, I think people have made a comment in the past that some of my work can be quite negative. It often ends at a point where like, oh my God, like some character's going to get killed or eaten by something. So it was a bit of a spin there to try and do something. I think it's quite a hopeful ending. I hope it's got something that kind of leaves people, you know, looking forward rather than kind of, oh my God, this is like, what is this horrible book I've just read, you know? So yeah, it was definitely a conscious thing. I think because of the nature of the story and kind of what's gone before that as well, like that was important to me, that it was left on a slightly different note, change, you know, it's a change of key or whatever you call it. Yeah, definitely.
And then like the big question I have walking away from the book and that ending, the other comparison to Jim Woodring is that's kind of his life project. You know, is this one ongoing growing mythology? And Ohm strikes me as this is something that you could keep just expanding forever. But I don't know, I'm curious about that. Like, is that the plan? Do you know where you're going next?
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to do that. One of the kind of really exciting things for me has been, you know, self-publishing is like quite hard. It can be demoralizing at times. It can be, you know, why am I drawing this comic that 10 people want to read? So it was really a confidence boost for me when I was approached by the Mansion Press. It's kind of reinvigorated my kind of appetite for these stories. But I also think, you know, almost something it's a really helpful part of my life. It's something I enjoy working on. I guess what I mean by that is I think the stories are kind of a reflection of wherever I was at that particular time. As I say, over 8 years, and I think some of the early ones are a bit goofier and a bit kind of carefree, and then some of them are a bit heavier or what have you. But that's actually that's a good thing for me to be able to kind of work those things out without, it sounds like a therapy session, but it's not. It's kind of putting those experiences on the page. And as I say, I think if you've experienced something, there's a good chance that many, many other people have experienced something very similar or can get something out of that. And I think it's kind of translating that experience into a story that other people will react to. As I say, I think if people first look at this, to see little white fat man with big yellow nipples, and I think that's what it's going to be. But I hope there's some kind of depth to the writing there. I really hope there is anyway, and that comes across.
And there's certainly depth to the nipples.
Yeah, well, it tends to be the first question anyone asks me is like, why have they all got giant nipples? And all I can say is that's got to be buried deep in my subconscious. I have no idea where they came from.
Well, it's going to make the eventual Ohm dolls much more successful.
Yeah, exactly. But it's also quite a good identifying feature. I don't know of any other cartoon characters that are identified by the nipples, so you know, it does help them stand out.
Well, and it's indicative of, and you're talking about doing these very personal stories that also resonate universally. And that's something I'm really fascinated by, because I teach, and so I see a lot of students hammer on universals, but they do it in a stock way. Yeah. And when someone finds a way to not hammer at a universal, but speak to a universal in a very personal way, then it actually lands more. And I think the fact that you seem to have right out the gate just been comfortable with the fact that you're not going to self-edit. Like if it's going to have big nipples and it's going to be a story about nipples and the ground squirting out milk, there's a vulnerability to that makes it super accessible, and it gives that psychedelic feeling, but not in the sense of like I took a bunch of drugs. And that's a really beautiful thing in the book.
That's kind of like a term I've used myself to describe my books, but I don't psychedelic. And I think it was just through ease. A lot of the time it was through the color and but I don't know if it's quite right. I agree. I think it's more about trying to.
I think maybe sometimes it might be right.
So sometimes it might be, yeah. But yeah, it's kind of an interesting one. I mean, I love artists like Crumb and stuff like that, but I'm not trying to directly riff off those things. Yeah.
So is there a relationship, like, because you're shying away from that word a little bit, and I'm just curious about accessing, because the psychedelia is kind of accessing that subconscious, but like if you're just allow yourself to be vulnerable in a way where you access it anyways, that seems to be what's coming through to me more than like, hey, I took some shrooms and I saw some trippy shit.
Yeah, I think, do you know what I think is kind of interesting? We were talking about this thing a little bit earlier about like the word and om. And like where I first came across that was probably like in kind of the Beats, Kerouac, stuff like that. And they weren't writing textbooks about Eastern religions. They were doing their 1950s American interpretation of that stuff. And I think that is interesting in a way where you kind of merging cultures or putting your own personal experience into these things. Yeah, so that psychedelic thing, you know, which feeds on from that, which is about, it's got a lot of links to Eastern religions, I think. A lot of the imagery is drawn from there. That may be where the kind of similarities are.
Well, and it's worth remembering, you know, the reason that psychotropic drugs work on our brains is because we have receptors for those chemicals inside of our brains, which, you know, the implication being that at some points our bodies are capable of manufacturing those same chemicals, or at least chemicals that are chemically similar enough to work in the same way. I think that there's no coincidence that when people started to experiment with, you know, man-made psychotropic medications, that people started connecting with these older kind of traditions, because I think that those mechanisms are active in all of us in some type of small or sometimes larger way, just in different sort of, you know, we talk about it as in the context of our milieu, right? But you know, that doesn't mean that that's the only psychedelic experience that anybody ever had came off of a piece of blotter paper.
That's a great point.
I wish there was a question at the end of that. I apologize. Pretend that I asked something.
Well, but you're talking about like the archetypal nature of stuff, and that those experiences that ride underneath, and whether they're reached through psychotropic drugs or open assimilation of the things around you and processing them, which is how I interpret Andy's work, that it's the kind of this open reception of what's around them, and then an honest speaking and unedited speaking about it can get you to the same place in some sense.
Yeah. What's kind of been really interesting for me writing the stories is it's kind of this framework is there. So like we all have these kind of thoughts and they'll drift off and what have you, but almost this kind of framework where they can be dropped into and like have a character sitting ready to kind of inhabit that story or tell that, kind of get that emotion across. And you know, it's a fairly, I'd say it's a fairly small core group of characters in this in the story, but they definitely have their own personalities and kind of aspects of me that it will be, you know, I'll be trying to communicate things with. But Carson, to your original point, I would definitely see this as being an expanding world. I would love to kind of push this further, explore more of the kind of landscapes. You know, you can tell I like drawing cartoon characters and monsters, so let's see what else comes out of there. But yeah, I would really like to see how far I can push this going forward.
We can't wait to see how you do it. Yeah. I mean, it's a very exciting project, and anybody who's reading this, I get the feeling that there are not an unlimited amount of copies of this book.
It's quite a small, print run initially. I think we've done only about 500. They are shipping from France, but they ship internationally, so anyone can order a copy. I think it might be available in a few comic shops in the States, but I'd have to double check that. But you know, it's such a great experience for me to see these books collected in this way, and I'm really proud and happy with how this has come together.
Well, yeah,
it's a fantastic book. Yeah,
thank you.
You should be incredibly proud, and it's a great, an amazing achievement for a first book, and really is quite inspirational, and very excited to see what you do next.
Yeah, thanks very much, and really appreciate the kind of support you've given the book, and you know, it's great to be able to come on here and talk about these things.
Yeah, we really.
In case I didn't make this appeal directly enough, go buy this book. There it
Yeah,
is.
let's sell it out quick and incentivize more for sure. We'll put links in the bottoms to
that's great.
To Huber editions. It's definitely worth the shipping overseas. But yeah, you're right. There might be the places that I would suggest would be Monocomet, Escape Pod, Floating
Escape Pod
World,
Comics.
and I just got some books from Partners and Son in Philadelphia, who seem to have a really good selection of like underground indie stuff. So if people want to check those sources, and I mean, you'll probably pay more because they have to cover their international shipping, but I don't remember it being a terrible lot to ship this book, and very, very well worth it. And hopefully that can incentivize a larger print one with easier international distribution.
Yeah, here's hoping. So I'm going to be at the Angle M Festival in March. So I'm really excited to see kind of who's going to be there, and hopefully meet some of the artists. It's been a long time since I've been at a convention, so just looking forward to getting back into the swing of things. Really.
Are you going to bring your own mask?
I don't think I'll bring my mask. No. People saying I should do T-shirts, just white with two big yellow nipples. But there might be a good merchandising opportunity.
Like actually 3D, like made out of that stress ball foam.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's the product. That's the next thing that goes in the store.
I can't wait to see some cosplays,
And we'll be able to solve what the line is, right? Depending on how to put the costume together.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, thanks so much for talking to us today, Andy. And go out and buy his book, everybody. And while you're at it, pick up The Strange Death of Alex Raymond if you haven't yet. And I hope that you guys are all having a wonderful day.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks very much, guys. Cheers.
You want to see all these books? Smash that subscribe button and the like button and the bell, and then you get them.